The Convergence War had burned across the galaxy for 317 years, and no one alive could remember what had started it anymore. The Vulcaran sovereignty controlled the eastern spiral arms with their crystalline hive minds that thought, in perfect mathematical harmony, each individual node connected to billions of others through quantum entanglement. That made their fleets move like living organisms made of starships, and spite the Thasic collective dominated the western reaches with warriors bred in gene forges and linked through neural networks that turned entire armies into single thinking weapons of flesh and fury. Between them lay a graveyard of civilizations. The two ancient powers had fought so long that war had become their culture, their economy, their reason for existing at all. And they fought according to rules that both sides honored, because without those rules, the war would end in mutual extinction. Within a month, the codes of escalation defined everything. What weapons could be used where, which civilian targets were acceptable losses. How many ships could engage in each theater. Even the proper formations for fleet combat that had been refined over centuries of carefully managed slaughter. Both sides possessed weapons that could crack planets, like eggs, or ignite stars into supernovas. But these sat in locked vaults because using them meant the other side would respond in kind, and then there would be no war left to fight and no civilization left to wage it, so instead they killed each other slowly, methodically, in battles that followed scripts written by long-dead tacticians. The younger species of the Galactic Council watched in helpless horror as world after world was reduced to radioactive ash or crystallized wastelands. But they could do nothing, because both the Vulcaran and the Thasic held permanent seats on the Council, and any intervention would shatter the delicate balance that kept the killing contained to only 100 systems instead of 10,000. The war had become a machine that fed on lives and resources and hope, and it would grind on forever, because neither side could afford to lose, and neither side remembered how to win. Into this ancient nightmare came humanity. The human colony ship Perseverance had been traveling for 43 years at sublight speeds, carrying 50,000 sleeping colonists toward a world their probes had identified as suitable for settlement. When it encountered a Vulcaran scout vessel in what humans thought was neutral space, the Vulcaran thought nothing was neutral anymore. Admiral Kethrin of the Sovereignty manifested his consciousness in the communication crystals and studied these new creatures with mild interest, running their biological data through pattern analysis algorithms that compared them to 7,000 known species. Humans were young, barely out of their home system, with fusion drives that the Vulcaran had abandoned as primitive 12,000 years ago, and they seemed genuinely unaware that they had just wandered into a war zone that had been contested for longer than their entire recorded history. Kethrin found this charming, in the way an ancient being finds the innocence of children charming. Offered them the standard terms: join the Sovereignty, contribute their resources and population to the war effort, and receive protection from the Thasic collective who would otherwise harvest their genetics for the gene forgets. The alternative was to be left alone in space. That the Thasic considered their hunting grounds. Captain Elena Vasquez appeared on the view screen, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with gray streaking her black hair and eyes that had seen too much of the dark between stars. And she listened to the Admiral's offer with the kind of patience that made Kethrin's crystalline matrices itch with something he would have called unease, if his species still felt such things when he finished. She smiled without warmth. We didn't come to the stars to pick sides in someone else's war, she said in the flat tone of someone stating an obvious fact. Kethrin found this response registered in his databases as naive, with a secondary classification of suicidal, he explained. With the patience of the immortal for the mayfly, that neutrality was not an option. That space itself had been divided between the two powers. That even the so-called neutral zones were just territories that both sides had agreed to devastate. Later, Vasquez listened to all of this and then asked a question that would be recorded in both Vulcan and Thasic archives as the first sign that humanity did not think like other species. How long has this war been going on? 317 of years, Catherine replied. And how many have died? The Admiral calculated across multiple databases approximately 400 trillion sentient beings across all species involved. Vasquez nodded slowly. And what happens when one of you wins? This question caused a 7-millisecond pause in Catherine's processing, which for a being who thought at quantum speeds was equivalent to a biological creature standing slack-jawed for several minutes. The war cannot be won, he finally said. Only prosecuted according to the codes. Then it's not a war, Vasquez said. It's a suicide pact with extra steps. She terminated the communication before Catherine could respond. The Vulcan Admiral spent the next several hours analyzing the conversation, running the human's words through every philosophical and strategic framework his civilization had developed. And he kept arriving at the same conclusion that his logic matrices labeled as impossible. The humans had looked at the Convergence War, the eternal conflict that defined galactic civilization, the clash of titans that had shaped the political reality of 1,000 worlds. And they had dismissed it as stupid, not evil, not terrifying, not even impressively destructive, just stupid. Catherine filed his report with the Sovereignty High Command and flagged humanity as a species of potential interest. Then returned to his duties because the war demanded his attention, and these strange creatures would learn their place soon enough. The Perseverance continued toward their target world, and Captain Vasquez called a meeting of her senior staff. They gathered in the observation deck, where they could see the stars that their sleeping colonists had crossed decades to reach. And Vasquez laid out their situation with brutal clarity. They were trapped between two civilizations that had turned war into a religion. Both sides had made it clear that neutrality was impossible, and their ship had weapons that might as well be pointed sticks against the forces that controlled this region of space. We have 3 options, she said, counting them on her fingers. We can join one side and become part of their war machine. We can try to run and probably get caught by the other side. Or we can settle our colony and hope they forget about us. Her second officer, Commander James Park, shook his head. They won't forget, he said. We're resources now, whether we like it or not. Then what do you suggest? Park pulled up the data they had intercepted about the Convergence War. Centuries of battle reports and casualty figures and strategic analyses that both sides apparently shared publicly, because why not when the whole galaxy already knew every move in their endless chess game? I suggest we learn everything we can about how they fight, he said, because sooner or later we're going to be fighting too. Vasquez looked out at the stars and thought about the sleeping colonists who had left Earth hoping for a new beginning, not knowing they were sailing into the middle of a war that had already consumed 400 trillion lives. Then we better learn fast, she said. 6 months later, the war came to humanity, and it came with fire. The human colony of New Pittsburgh had been established for exactly 5 months when it died. The settlement occupied a large asteroid in what humans had believed was unclaimed space, home to 3 mining operations and 40,000 colonists who thought they had finally escaped the troubles of old Earth. And they were wrong about everything. A Thasic fleet of 70 warships used the asteroid field as a shortcut during a tactical redeployment, treating the space as empty, because the codes of escalation had designated this sector as a non-combat transit zone where neither side would position permanent assets. The humans living there did not count as permanent assets. The Vulcan ambush force had been waiting in the shadows of the larger asteroids for 3 weeks, running silent and cold, because they had learned through intercepted communications that the Thasic were planning this exact maneuver, and the codes permitted ambushes in transit zones as long as no permanent military installations were targeted. New Pittsburgh was not a military installation. The battle lasted 9 minutes. The Thasic fleet scattered when the Valkyran opened fire, their neural-linked coordination allowing them to respond as one organism. But the ambush had been perfectly planned, and 17 Thasic ships died in the first volley. The Thasic responded with bioplasma torpedoes that could melt through Valkyran crystal hulls, and another 12 ships vanished in bursts of superheated matter. The humans on New Pittsburgh watched the battle unfold on their scanners and sent out distress signals that both fleets ignored because they were busy killing each other. According to centuries-old tactical doctrine, a Valkyran cruiser, badly damaged and venting atmosphere, collided with one of the mining stations and detonated its reactor core in a blast that cracked the asteroid and sent fragments spinning into the paths of other installations. The Thasic, regrouping for a counterattack, fired a spread of missiles at what they thought was a Valkyran supply depot hiding behind the largest asteroid. But their targeting computers had misidentified the colony's main habitat dome. 40,000 humans died without either side noticing until the battle was over. Both fleets retreated after achieving what their commanders considered a tactical draw. The Valkyran had inflicted heavier casualties, but the Thasic had maintained their transit corridor, and the codes were satisfied. 3 days later, human rescue ships arrived at New Pittsburgh to find debris and bodies. The United Nations Space Command received formal apologies from both the Valkyran sovereignty and the Thasic collective, along with detailed explanations of which specific sections of the codes of escalation had been followed during the engagement, and assurances that all proper protocols had been observed. Neither power offered to stop using human space as a battlefield. Neither power offered compensation beyond what the code specified for incidental civilian losses during approved combat operations. Neither power seemed to understand why the humans were upset. Admiral Chen Wei of the UNSC read both apologies in his office on Luna Station and then spent 6 hours reviewing everything humanity had learned about the Convergence War since first contact. And what he found made him physically ill. The war was not being fought to achieve any strategic objective. It was being fought because fighting had become the foundation of both civilizations' economies, political structures, and social identities. The Valkyran sovereignty's entire culture revolved around optimizing war effort through their hive mind consciousness. And without the war, their perfect mathematical harmony would have nothing to harmonize toward. The Thasic collective had engineered themselves into living weapons over thousands of years, breeding out everything soft or peaceful or creative. And without war, they would have to face the horror of what they had made themselves into. Both sides had weapons that could end the conflict in months. But using those weapons meant the war would end, and then what? Then the politicians would have to explain why they had wasted 300 years. Then the generals would have to justify why 400 trillion beings had died for nothing. Then both civilizations would have to rebuild themselves from scratch without the enemy that defined them. So they kept fighting according to the codes, managing the slaughter, keeping it contained and controlled and eternal. It's not a war, Chan said to the empty room, echoing Captain Vasquez's words from 6 months ago. It's a machine, and we're about to be fed into it. He called an emergency session of the UNC Security Council. They met in a bunker beneath Geneva, in a room that had been built centuries ago, when humanity still thought their biggest threats were each other. And Chum presented his analysis with the flat affect of a man who had run out of emotions. "We have three options," he said. And the words were almost identical to what Vasquez had said half a year ago. "We join one side, we run, or we find a fourth option," the Secretary General, an elderly woman from Kenya named Amara Okonkwo, studied the data for a long time. "What fourth option?" she asked. "We break the machine." The room erupted in argument. Breaking the convergence war was impossible. Humanity was too small and too weak. They would be crushed if they interfered. They should focus on survival, not heroics. John waited for the shouting to die down, and then he said something that made everyone stop. "They think we're going to behave like every other species they have encountered, which means they think we will either join them or die quietly. But we have an advantage they don't expect." "What advantage?" Okonkwo asked. "We think they're both insane." He pulled up comparative psychological profiles that human xenologists had compiled. Every other species in this galaxy has been shaped by the convergence war. They have grown up knowing that this is just how things are, that eternal conflict between ancient powers is the natural order. But we are from Earth, where we spent 10,000 years fighting stupid wars and learning to recognize them as stupid. He highlighted sections of the codes of escalation. They fight according to rules, but those rules are not designed to win the war. They are designed to perpetuate it, which means the rules themselves are the real enemy. "You want to fight both of them?" Someone asked in disbelief. "No," Chun said. "I want to make them stop fighting each other. And the only way to do that is to make the war impossible, to conduct the way they have been conducting it for 3 centuries. How?" Chun smiled without humor. "We make it too expensive, too unpredictable, and too stupid to continue over the next month." The UNSC developed what would later be called Operation Jester's Gambit. They studied the convergence war the way humans had once studied natural disasters, looking for patterns and weaknesses and pressure points. They identified the unspoken rules that both sides followed, the tacit agreements that kept the war running smoothly, the black market networks and intelligence back channels and diplomatic fictions that allowed 2 civilizations to kill each other efficiently, and then they planned how to break all of it. Captain Vasquez, promoted to Commodore and given command of humanity's first strike fleet, read the operational orders and laughed until she cried. "This is the craziest thing I have ever seen," she said. "Will it work?" Chun asked. "Probably not," Vasquez admitted. "But it will definitely make them pay attention." The first strike launched 6 weeks after New Pittsburgh died a small human fleet. 12 ships with outdated weapons and drives that the Valkyran would have considered museum pieces jumped into the Karish station system and opened fire on a neutral trading post that everyone knew served as a smuggling hub for both the Valkyran and Thasic black markets. The station's shields held for approximately 40 seconds before the humans fired, something the defenders did not expect. Documentary evidence broadcasting on every available frequency. The humans transmitted detailed records of illegal weapons sales, treaty violations, and intelligence operations that both sides had been conducting through the neutral station for decades. Then they destroyed the station completely. Both the Valkyran and the Thasic demanded an immediate explanation. Commodore Vasquez responded personally. "You wanted us to understand the rules," she said. "So we studied them, and we noticed that Karish Station violated approximately 400 different sections of the codes of escalation, which means destroying it was perfectly legal." She paused. "We will continue to enforce the codes exactly as written, not as conveniently ignored." The broadcast ended with humanity's next move. They released all of their military doctrines, ship specifications, tactical databases, and strategic planning documents to the public galactic networks. Every species in known space could now see exactly how humans intended to fight both. Ancient powers demanded humanity stop this insanity, and submit to proper integration into one side or the fun side or the fine or. Other humanity responded by attacking both of them simultaneously. The attacks came within minutes of each other, synchronized across 17 light years with timing that suggested either brilliant planning or complete madness. Human Strike Group Alpha hit a Vulcan supply depot in the Terthos system using suicide drones loaded with electromagnetic pulse generators that were laughably primitive by galactic standards but perfectly effective against crystalline computer systems that had not been hardened against such crude weapons because no one had used them. In 8,000 years, Human Strike Group Beta struck a Thasic shipyard in the Corvax Nebula with the exact same drones, the exact same tactics, the exact same timing. Both attacks caused minimal actual damage, but maximum confusion, because humanity had just done something that violated the fundamental logic of the Convergence War. They had attacked both sides equally. The Vuzdizbui codes of escalation had no provisions for this. 300 years of precedent had no framework for understanding it. Every species that had ever been caught between the Vulcan and Thasic had picked a side, because picking a side meant you at least knew who your enemies were. But humanity had just declared that they considered both ancient powers equally problematic. Admiral Catherine, who had first encountered the humans 6 months ago, ran the attack patterns through his analysis matrices and arrived at 17 different conclusions that all contradicted each other. The humans were either working with the Thasic, and the attack on the shipyard was a false flag operation designed to provide cover, or they were working with the Vulcan and the supply depot strike was the false flag, or they were actually insane enough to fight both sides, or they were engaged in some kind of elaborate suicide ritual that Catherine's databases had no cultural context for understanding. He compiled his report and sent it to the Sovereignty High Command with a priority flag that roughly translated to, "I have no idea what is happening, and I think we should be worried." The Thasic response was more direct. They sent a battle fleet to the nearest human colony with orders to bombard it into submission and force humanity to choose a side. The fleet arrived at the colony, expecting to find frightened civilians ready to surrender. Instead, they found the entire colony population had evacuated 3 days earlier, and the settlement had been converted into a broadcasting station. As the Thasic fleet approached, every communication system in the colony activated simultaneously and began transmitting on frequencies that bypassed Thasic military encryption and went directly to the neural link networks that connected their warriors. Broadcast was simple. Testimony from Thasic civilians who had been displaced by the war. Genetic analysis showing how centuries of combat breeding had reduced their species diversity to dangerous levels. And economic models demonstrating that the Thasic collective was spending 87% of its resources on a war that produced no strategic gains. The fleet commander tried to jam the transmissions, but the humans had scattered the broadcasting equipment across the entire colony, and it would take days to destroy it all by the time they silenced the last transmitter. The damage was done. 17 million Thasic warriors had received information their government had spent 3 centuries hiding from them, and the neural link networks meant they had all shared it with each other instantaneously. The fleet withdrew. Without firing a shot, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Ambassador Chun represented humanity because Admiral Chun had decided that having the same last name would confuse people, and he thought that was funny, which the other species found either charming or disturbing, depending on their psychology. The Vulcan and Thasic both demanded sanctions against humanity for violation of dozens of protocols regarding acceptable conduct during wartime. Ambassador Chun listened to the complaints with the patient expression of someone watching children argue about whose imaginary friend was stronger. When they finished, she stood and addressed the council. "My people have been studying your war," she said, "and we have reached a conclusion that I think you all need to hear. She activated a holographic display that showed 300 years of battles, casualties, territory exchanges, and resource expenditures. "This is not a war," she said. "This is a business arrangement between two civilizations that have built their entire societies around permanent conflict, and the rest of you have been paying the price." The Vulcaran representative, a crystalline entity that resembled a geometric flower made of knives, objected. "The Convergence War is a tragic necessity," it said. "Without the codes of escalation, both our civilizations would be forced to use total war doctrines that would devastate the galaxy, then make peace." Chun said, "The Thasic would never accept our terms." The Thasic representative, a 2-meter-tall warrior whose body was more weapon than flesh, made a sound like grinding metal. "The Vulcaran would never accept our terms. Have you tried?" Chun asked. Silence. "In 300 years. Have either of you actually attempted serious peace negotiations, or have you just been managing the war?" More silence. Jen pulled up economic data. The Thasic Collective employs 400 billion beings in war-related industries. The Vulcaran sovereignty has synchronized 92% of its hive mind resources to war optimization. And both of you have political structures that would collapse if the fighting stopped. She looked at both representatives. "You are not at war because you hate each other. You are at war because you have forgotten how to be anything else." The Vulcaran representative's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been anger. "And what do you propose? Human? That we simply stop fighting because you find it inconvenient?" "No," Chun said. "We propose that you stop fighting because we are going to make it impossible to continue the way you have been." She outlined humanity's strategy with brutal clarity. They would continue to attack targets that both sides used but pretended did not exist. They would broadcast information that both governments wanted hidden. They would ignore the codes of escalation whenever those codes served to perpetuate rather than limit the conflict. And they would make the war so expensive and unpredictable and publicly embarrassing that continuing it would cost more than making peace. "You cannot win this war," the Thasic representative said. "You have 14 colonies and perhaps 10,000 warships. We have entire sectors and millions. We do not need to win," Chun said. "We just need to make you lose in a way you cannot ignore." The council chamber erupted in arguments that would continue for weeks. Meanwhile, human fleets continued their campaign. They hit a Vulcaran communication relay that was secretly being used to coordinate black market operations with Thasic contacts. And they did it by feeding the Vulcaran's own intelligence reports back to them in real time during the attack, making it impossible to deny what the facility had really been doing. They rescued a Thasic colony ship that had been declared lost in combat, but had actually been captured by Vulcaran forces and held for ransom, and they returned the colonists, along with recordings of the negotiations that both sides had claimed never happened. They attacked supply lines that fed the war machine while carefully avoiding civilian targets. And every attack came with documentation explaining exactly which provisions of the codes of escalation justified the strike. The Vulcaran tried to end humanity's interference with overwhelming force. They assembled a battle fleet of 300 ships, more than enough to reduce Earth itself to molten slag, and they sent it to the human home system with Admiral Catherine in command. Fleet arrived, expecting to find desperate defenses. Instead, they found Earth's moon had been turned into a gigantic billboard covering the lunar surface, and letters visible from orbit were mathematical equations, tactical analyses, and strategic plans, all broadcasting on every available frequency. I can read them with growing horror. The humans had compiled detailed projections showing exactly how the Vulcaran could win the Convergence War in 9 years. If they abandoned the codes of escalation and committed to total war doctrine, the plans were brilliant, ruthless, and entirely feasible. They were also absolutely forbidden if the sovereignty followed these plans. The Thasic would respond with their own total war doctrine and the galaxy would burn, which was exactly why the codes existed in the first place, but now the information was public. Every Velkaran hive mind node could access it. Every quantum-linked consciousness could debate it, and the question would spread through their civilization like a virus. Why had their leaders chosen eternal war over achievable victory? If Catherine destroyed Earth, the information would still spread because the humans had already transmitted it across every network in known space. If he retreated, it would look like the sovereignty was afraid of what their own people would think. "You are clever," Catherine transmitted to the Human Defense Coordinator, "but you are also forcing us into a corner." Commodore Vasquez appeared on his view screen. "Good," she said. "Corners are where you finally have to make real decisions instead of just following 300-year-old scripts." The Velkaran fleet withdrew without firing a shot. 3 days later, the Thasic received the same information with on. The Convergence War began to fracture in ways that 300 years of careful management had never anticipated. Human forces employed what military analysts would later describe as tactical schizophrenia. No consistent doctrine, no predictable patterns, no logical strategic framework that either ancient power could model and counter. One day they would fight using Velkaran Crystal Blade close combat tactics against Thasic bioships. The next they would adopt Thasic swarm strategies against Velkaran formations. And the day after that, they would do something neither side had ever seen because humans kept inventing new methods of causing chaos. They hacked Velkaran communication crystals to broadcast Thasic war hymns during crucial fleet coordination moments, causing 7-millisecond processing delays that, in quantum-linked combat, meant the difference between victory and catastrophic failure. They infiltrated Thasic neural networks with propaganda suggesting that their high command had been compromised by Vulcan sympathizers, which was obvious nonsense, but the very fact that such suggestions could propagate through their mind links caused trust failures across entire battle groups. They staged false flag operations so transparent that both sides knew they were being manipulated but could not prove it conclusively to their own populations, which meant both governments had to waste resources investigating conspiracies that everyone knew were human-made. But the most devastating tactic was also the simplest. They started rescuing refugees for 3 centuries. Both the Velkaran and Thasic had treated civilian casualties as acceptable losses, statistical noise in the greater equation of eternal conflict, and they had kept those casualties carefully hidden from public awareness. Because both civilizations required popular support for the war effort, humanity found the survivors. They rescued Velkaran consciousness fragments that had been cut off from the hive mind during ship destructions. Beings who existed in states of isolation that their species considered worse than death. And they gave them voice. They extracted Thasic civilians from war zones, non-combatants who had been bred out of the warrior caste and left to die when their colonies became battlefields. And they recorded their stories. Every rescue came with broadcasts that reached across the galaxy for the first time in 300 years. The cost of the Convergence War had names and faces and voices of Velkaran Mother Node described watching her child fragments dissolve when their ship was destroyed in what both sides had classified as a minor skirmisher. Thasic Elder spoke about his gene line being terminated because the collective needed more warriors and fewer philosophers, a Sekari trader whose entire species had gone extinct, serving as logistics support for the Velkaran explained how his people had died, believing they were helping civilization survive humanity, gave them all platforms and protection, and refused to stop broadcasting their testimony, no matter how many demands both ancient powers issued. The effect was like acid eating through the foundation of the war. Machine citizens of both civilizations began asking questions their governments had spent centuries avoiding. Why was the war necessary? What were they actually fighting for? Why did the codes permit some atrocities but forbid others? And why had no one ever seriously attempted peace negotiations? Answers their leaders provided had worked for 300 years, but they stopped working when people could compare them to actual human costs. Admiral Chun coordinated the refugee operations from UNSC headquarters Almuna, and he watched the political situation develop with the careful attention of someone who knew they were gambling with humanity's survival. "We are making them very angry," his intelligence chief observed. "Good," Chun said. "Angry people make mistakes. They could also destroy us. They could have destroyed us 6 months ago," Chun pointed out, "but they did not, because we have made destroying us more expensive than ignoring us. And now we are making ignoring us impossible." He pulled up tactical displays showing human fleet positions. The Vulcaran tried overwhelming force, and we embarrassed them. The Thasic tried infiltration, and we turned it into a propaganda victory. And now they are both paralyzed because we have broken their primary weapon. "Which weapon?" "Predictability," Chun said. "They have fought each other for so long that they know exactly how the other side will respond to any action, which means they can manage the conflict indefinitely. But they do not know how we will respond because we keep changing the rules." The intelligence chief studied the displays. "How long can we keep this up?" "Until they decide to talk to each other instead of killing each other," Chun said. "Or until they decide to kill us instead." "And if they choose the second option?" Chun smiled without humor. "Then we have already broadcast enough information that every other species in the galaxy will know exactly why the Vulcaran and Thasic prefer eternal war to peace. And their civilizations will tear themselves apart from internal pressure, even if they succeed in destroying us." It was a strategy that required humanity to be willing to die to prove a point. Chun thought it was the most human thing they had ever done. The crisis came 3 months into Operation Jester's Gambit, a joint Vulcaran-Thasic task force, operating under a secret agreement that violated approximately 60 different provisions of the Codes of Escalation. Moved to eliminate the human refugee processing center at Sanctuary Station. The station was located in a nebula that provided natural sensor interference, defended by only a small human fleet, and home to over 200,000 refugees from dozens of species. Both ancient powers had decided that destroying it would send a clear message: stop interfering or be eliminated. The attack fleet numbered over 400 ships, the largest concentration of force either side had deployed in 50 years. They jumped into the nebula expecting to overwhelm human defenses within minutes. Instead, they found that humanity had anticipated exactly this response. The refugee station was empty. Every civilian had been evacuated 3 days earlier through a network of hidden jump routes that humans had been building since they first started rescue operations. The attacking fleet found themselves in a nebula that humans had spent months filling with sensor drones, communication relays, and enough surveillance equipment to track every ship movement in perfect detail. And all of it was broadcasting across the galaxy. Billions of beings watched the Vulcaran and Thasic commanders realize they had been caught in a trap that had no escape. They could attack the empty station and prove they were willing to murder refugees. They could retreat and admit they had violated the Codes of Escalation by cooperating with each other, or they could try to destroy the broadcasting equipment and spend weeks hunting down drones in a nebula while the entire galaxy watched them panic. The fleet commanders chose to retreat. Broadcasts continued for 6 hours after they left, showing detailed analysis of which ships had come from which fleet, which provisions of the codes both sides had violated, and most damaging of all, recorded communications showing that Vulcaran and Thasic officers had coordinated the attack. Together, the secret was out. Both sides were perfectly capable of cooperation when it served their purposes, which meant the war was a choice, not a necessity. Political earthquakes shook both civilizations. The Vulcaran sovereignty fractured as different Hive mind nodes began questioning whether the coordinated consciousness that had been optimized for eternal war was actually serving their interests. The Thasic Collective saw entire warrior castes demanding to know why they had been engineered into living weapons. If the enemy could be negotiated with reform movements that had been suppressed for centuries, suddenly found millions of supporters within weeks. Both governments faced internal crises that threatened their ability to continue the war. The Galactic Council received formal requests from both the Velcarin and Thasic for mediation of their conflict. It was the first time in 317 years that either side had admitted the war might be something other than inevitable. Ambassador Chun read the requests in her office and allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. They are going to try to blame each other. Her aide predicted, "Of course they are," Chun agreed. "And they are going to try to maintain as much of their current power structures as possible. And they are going to resist any real accountability for what they have done. So we keep fighting?" "No," Chun said. "Now we make them talk, and we make sure they cannot stop talking until something real changes." She drafted humanity's response. The UNSC would support peace negotiations on the condition that they were public, that all younger species affected by the war would have representation, that both sides would submit to independent investigation of war crimes, and that any treaty would include provisions for dismantling the weapons and systems designed to perpetuate eternal conflict. It was a list of demands that would have been laughable if humanity had made them 3 months ago. But 3 months ago, humanity had not yet proven they could bring the galaxy's two oldest powers to the negotiating table. 3 months ago, the Convergence War had still seemed eternal now. It seemed like something that could end, which was terrifying to everyone who had built their lives around it being permanent, but offered hope to everyone else. Praxis Station hung in the void between territories, a structure built 3,000 years ago when the galaxy still believed that different civilizations could resolve their differences through dialogue rather than violence. The station had been abandoned for most of the Convergence War because neither the Velcarin nor the Thasic saw any point in maintaining diplomatic facilities when diplomacy was dead. Now it had been reactivated, cleaned, and prepared to host what many believed would be either the most important peace conference in galactic history or the most spectacular failure of optimism over experience. Ambassador Elena Vasquez arrived 3 days early to inspect the arrangements. The station's AI, which had spent 3 centuries in dormant mode, greeted her with obvious confusion about why biological beings were suddenly interested in talking again. "Will this actually work?" it asked in a voice that suggested genuine curiosity. "Probably not," Vasquez admitted. "But we have to try anyway." The Vulcaran delegation arrived first, a contingent of 7 hive mind nodes representing different philosophical currents within the sovereignty, and they immediately began arguing among themselves about negotiating positions. The fact that they were arguing at all was revolutionary, because for 300 years the Velcarin had spoken with one unified voice, optimized for Warno. That optimization was fracturing. The Thasic came next, sending not just military commanders, but also civilians, genetic engineers, and even a few members of the extinct philosopher caste who had been secretly preserved against regulations. Their delegation looked like a war council, and a therapy session had collided. Ambassador Chen arrived with representatives from 47 species that had been affected by the Convergence War. Beings whose civilizations had been used as proxies or destroyed as collateral or simply ground up in the machine. The younger species filled half the conference hall, and their presence was a deliberate statement. This was not just about the Vulcan and Thasic anymore. The opening session began badly. The Vulcan chief negotiator, a crystalline entity that called itself Harmonious Resolution 12, opened by explaining that the sovereignty had always pursued peace but had been forced into conflict by Thasic aggression. the Thasic commander, a warrior named Kreth, whose body bore scars from 2 centuries of combat, countered that the collective had repeatedly offered peace terms, that the Valkyrin had rejected both sides presented. Documentation supporting their positions, both sides. Documentation was technically accurate and completely misleading. Vasquez let them argue for 3 hours before she interrupted. Everything you have both said is true, she announced. And all of it is irrelevant. The delegates turned to stare at her. You did not come here to determine who started the war, Vasquez continued, because that answer is buried under 3 centuries of grievances, and everyone in this room knows it. She activated a holographic display showing casualty figures. 400 trillion beings are dead, and they do not care who fired the first shot. They care that no one fired the last shot. Harmonious Resolution 12 flickered with what might have been irritation. The human speaks as if ending the war is simply a matter of choice. It is, Vasquez said flatly. You are both choosing to continue fighting. You have been choosing it every day for 300 years. And you can choose differently right now. The Thasic would never accept our minimum security requirements, the Valkyrin argued. The Valkyrin would never agree to our territorial demands. Kreth responded. Vasquez pulled up a document that made both delegations freeze. This is a treaty proposal drafted by your own diplomatic corps 87 years ago, she said. Both of you, working through back channels, actually came close to an agreement that would have ended the war. She highlighted key sections. It included security guarantees for the Valkyrin, territorial adjustments for the Thasic, shared jurisdiction over contested systems, and a framework for gradual demilitarization. That proposal was rejected. Harmonious Resolution 12 said, by your own leadership, Vasquez pointed out. Not by the Thasic. The negotiations collapsed because the Sovereignty High Command decided that implementing peace would be more disruptive to your society than continuing the war. She turned to Kreth. The Thasic negotiators reported the same conclusion. Your warrior councils determined that ending the conflict would require rebuilding your entire civilization, and it was easier to keep fighting. The silence in the conference hall stretched for several minutes. Finally, a Valkyrin node that had not spoken before activated. The human is correct, it said. We chose war over peace because peace was frightening. Kreth made a sound like breaking stone, as did we. Admission hung in the air like smoke. Ambassador Chun stood and addressed the assembly. Every species in this room has been harmed by your war, she said, gesturing to the representatives of the younger civilizations. And most of you believed there was no alternative because the Valkyrin and Thasic are ancient and powerful, and surely they must have good reasons for what they do. She paused, but they do not have good reasons. They have old habits, and there is a difference. A Sekiri delegate, one of the last survivors of a species that had been driven to near extinction serving as Valkyrin auxiliaries, spoke up. What guarantees do we have that any treaty will be honored? It asked. The codes of escalation were supposed to limit the war, but they became tools to perpetuate it. It was a good question. Vasquez had been expecting it. No guarantees, she said. Treaties are just paper unless people choose to honor them. But we can create structures that make honoring them easier than breaking them. She outlined humanity's proposal. The treaty would be enforced not by the Valkyrin or Thasic, but by a coalition of younger species who had no investment in the old conflict. Violations would be investigated publicly with full transparency. Both ancient powers would submit to gradual supervised disarmament of their total war weapon systems, and most importantly, the treaty would include provisions for regular review and modification, because circumstances would change. You are asking us to trust species that we could destroy. Harmonious Resolution 12 observed. Yes, Vasquez said, because the alternative is that you destroy each other. and you take the rest of us with you. The negotiations proceeded for 6 weeks. They collapsed 17 times. The Vulcaran walked out when the Thasic demanded access to contested mining systems. The Thasic withdrew when the Vulcaran insisted on maintaining certain surveillance networks. The younger species threatened to abandon the talks when both ancient powers tried to exempt themselves from war crimes investigations. Each time, humanity dragged everyone back to the table. Vasquez developed a reputation for absolutely refusing to accept that any problem was unsolvable when the Vulcaran claimed their hive mind structure made certain treaty provisions technically impossible. She brought in human programmers who demonstrated practical implementations when the Thasic argued that their genetic engineering made rapid demilitarization dangerous to their population's health. She found Thasic geneticists who proposed gradual modification programs when both sides insisted that younger species could not be trusted with enforcement authority. She broadcast recordings of every time the ancient powers had violated the codes of escalation with impunity. She was relentless, exhausting, and completely unwilling to let either side retreat into comfortable excuses. Admiral Chun watched the negotiations from Luna and marveled at what was happening. She's going to give herself a heart attack. His aide observed. Probably, Chun agreed. But she's also going to get a treaty. You sound certain. I'm certain that both the Vulcan and Thasic are more afraid of their own populations than they are of each other now, Chun said. And their populations are demanding peace. He pulled up reports from across. Both civilizations' reform movements were growing. Younger Vulcan nodes were questioning the hive mind's war optimization. Thasic civilians were demanding the right to choose lives beyond combat. And every day that the negotiations continued, more people on both sides were asking why peace had taken so long. The war machine is breaking down, Chum said. Not because we destroyed it, but because we made people see it clearly. The final treaty, formally designated the Praxis Accords, was signed on the 93rd day of negotiations. It was not elegant. It did not satisfy anyone completely. It left dozens of issues unresolved and created new problems that would take decades to address, but it ended the Convergence War. The Vulcaran Sovereignty and Thasic Collective agreed to immediate cessation of hostilities, withdrawal of forces from contested systems, submission to independent investigation of war crimes, gradual and supervised dismantlement of total war weapons, and establishment of a new Galactic Security Council with representation from younger species. Most importantly, they agreed to talk to each other regularly, publicly, and with the understanding that the treaty could be modified through negotiation rather than violence. The galaxy did not celebrate. Too many beings had died for celebration to feel appropriate, but across 1,000 worlds, people allowed themselves to hope that their children might grow up knowing peace. Ambassador Vasquez signed the treaty on behalf of humanity and then collapsed from exhaustion.